Welcome, I'm Jim Falk. Critical race theory, known by its acronym CRT, has become a household name and a hot political issue, talked about on every news show. In this McQuiston program, we're bringing you different perspectives. A State Board of Education member, an education journalist, and a professor of sociology and think tank fellow, so that you can hear varied perspectives and make up your own mind on what CRT is and how it impacts our schools and communities. Vince, let's meet our guest and hear what they have to say.
Thank you, Jim. And yes, we're bringing you three guests on this topic. First, we have Eesha Pendharkar, who is a reporter for Education Week covering race and opportunity in schools. Education Week reports on education issues and news all over the country. Second, we have Patricia Hardy, who since 2002 holds an elected position on the Texas State Board of Education, District 11. Prior to that, Pat taught high school geography and history for 30 years. As a teacher, she served on both state textbook committees and state assessment review teams. Our third guest is Dr. Rashawn Ray. He's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and is a professor of sociology and executive director of the Lab for Applied Social Science Research, known as LASSR, at the University of Maryland, College Park. Rashawn has published over 50 books and articles. Now, since the Brookings Institution focuses on pragmatic and innovative ideas on how to solve problems facing society, Rashawn, let's start with an overall understanding of what critical race theory is and how it became such a controversial issue.
Well, thank you all for having me on. I mean, obviously, this is the question of the hour, one of the main ones in particular. Critical race theory is a theoretical framework, a perspective that's primarily rooted in legal studies that has been expanded in the social sciences and has actually been around since the 1970s and the 1980s, coined by Derek Bell, kind of tested by Kimberly Crenshaw. These are all scholars and professors. And really what the framework was set up to do was to understand the way that U.S. social institutions impact inequality, specifically racial inequality. Critical race theory, what it posits is that social institutions are embedded and laced with oftentimes racist policies, racist regulations, laws, and rules that govern over us. And as sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva has stated, what it really highlights is that racism can exist without racist. So it's one of those things where it's not calling an individual, or in this case, maybe even specifically white people, racist. What it's saying is that our social institutions, that as a nation we have never healed to address the way that inequities exist, say in the criminal justice system, say disproportionately being more likely to incarcerate certain people over others. In healthcare, where we see disproportionate amount of care, the way that people perceive individuals' pain, which might actually lead to and does contribute to a much higher mortality rate for mothers and newborn babies. We could also go to employment, where we see huge disparities in who's likely to be hired based on even where they got their degree from, where we see that having an Ivy League degree compared to a state institution doesn't have the same perks, say, for Black people as it does for whites. So critical race theory says, look, this isn't solely about individuals. This is about unchecked ways that racism permeates our social institutions. This is a framework to understand it. And by doing so, it becomes a lens by which to view the world. Now, I'll say critical race theory, and we've analyzed this in Brookings with my colleagues, Alexandra Gibbons. We found that in legislation across the country, that overwhelmingly what it shows is that a bunch of legislation is not about critical race theory, but instead it's about checking diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we see that more holistically, which shies away from what critical race theory actually is.
You know, is there a way to summarize the politicization of it and the polarizing effect that it's had?
I think so. Look, The way that we describe it is that critical race theory has become a boogeyman of sorts, a catch-all for the way that people think about racial diversity. And it's important to note that it now has extensions to look at issues related to sexism, issues related to homophobia, and really becomes a way to attack what is happening in our classrooms is simply a way to help children make sense of inequality and to help them not repeat some of the things that have happened in the past. And part of what we're seeing politically, particularly through the media, whether that be on social media or through political pundits, is that critical race theory has become weaponized, where now is being suggested that some sort of way that white people are being attacked in the classroom, that children are being made to feel a particular way, and on the other hand, that Black children are made to feel like overwhelmingly victims. The research does not support that. The theory does not support that. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that a teacher doesn't go too far in one way or the other.
I'd like to bring Eesha into the conversation because she covers this. Eesha, when and how did it become such a flashpoint in K through 12?
Thank you for asking that question. So I think it started last summer with a lot of states starting to introduce legislation that had a lot of the similar language as an executive order issued by President Trump, which now President Biden has struck down. And that order was meant for federal employees in response to the diversity trainings that we saw popping up and becoming more popular in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd. So I think all of this started as a backlash about 2020 or early 2021 as a response to school districts becoming more aware of the systemic racism and trying to put into place diversity, equity, and inclusion policies and trainings. We started seeing a lot of the early laws in, I think, April 2021.
I guess in a sense, what's happened is CRT has been conflated with diversity, equity, and inclusion. Is that a fair statement?
I think so. I think Rashawn was correct in saying it's become a catch-all. It is now associated with anything to do with teaching of race and racism, also sexism, sexual identity, gender identities. So it's just become a term that's been, misused a lot and now has become demonized.
Pat, I'd love for you to give us an idea. What's happening in Texas? I mean, what's your perspective?
I'm confused because you're saying there's critical race theory, and then all this stuff about inequality, the lens of racism and all that sort of stuff, that's not critical race theory. The critical race theory has been taken into the public schools. The teachers have been trained. They've read books, The White Fragility and all this sort of stuff. And they've been calling this out to the students and to the teachers that there is systemic racism, which I think there is racism, but I don't know what is meant by systemic racism.
Well, let's focus our attention on the bill in Texas. What's in that bill in Texas that
there are things in the bill that specifically you don't want to call out to students. You don't want to teach through the lens of racism, and that's what the different teachers were calling out students for their color of their skin and trying to make them feel guilty if there was a privilege connected to their life, just not because of necessarily that all the students are the idea is that white privilege exists. And this privilege, which some kids do have other privileges over others, but it's not necessarily white, black, or brown. It is just socioeconomic. Some of the things that you address, that students do not get an equal treatment or medical help and so forth. That is a economic thing, not a racial thing. And they've tried to make the students feel guilty about what they have in the way of advantages. And there certainly are some people who do have advantages, but it's not necessarily the color of their skin, it is the socioeconomic background they have.
I think nationwide, we're seeing that in some jurisdictions, like in Texas and North Carolina, other parts of the country, a chilling effect being put on teachers, where it's unclear to them exactly how they should approach a particular topic. And it's important to note, look, again, I'm a professor. I teach a lot of students, and oftentimes it's not necessarily things that are in a curriculum per se. It's questions that come up from students. It's things that are coming from their own experiences. And so it's putting a chilling effect on teachers being able to do this. We also know that some teachers and some superintendents have either resigned, been forced out, or actually been fired for having these particular discussions. And it's unfortunate because I can tell people when they get to the college level, students, no matter their background, feel a particular way that they didn't know the way that inequality manifests in their life, and they blame their school system and oftentimes their parents as well.
Rashawn, I've heard some relationship between CRT and Marxism, and is there a validity to that position?
You know, there's definitely some historical roots with critical race theory that go back to Marxism. And I think part of thinking about Marxism as well is that people have that misconstrued. It's overwhelmingly framed as socialism, when instead Marxism is the main framework we use to look at socioeconomic status. So the way that we hear the policymaker talking about socioeconomic status, Marxism in the academy becomes one of the main ways to look at that, primarily in the European context. But of course, it has extensions to what's happening in the US. Critical race theory says, okay, the same way that we've approached social class, the same way we know that if you're from a rural area in Texas and you don't have high-speed internet and you can't do virtual learning, that is a social class impact. We can also take the same lens, apply the same type of approach, and see the way that racial inequality manifests. These are just facts. It's unfortunate that they are, but those inequalities do exist.
And Eesha, this is what we're really seeing as being one of the main criticisms of CRT, is that there is this tie to Marxism, and even going so far as to say that it's anti-capitalist.
I guess that is one of the critiques. The other large one is that it is indoctrinating students. It's the large critique I've seen across the country is that critical race theory is somehow indoctrinating students, white students specifically, to hate themselves or feel like oppressors and carry some guilt for it. And that's also been a common criticism.
How should we address racism in our schools? What would you recommend?
Well, in the context of history, we have to always teach the facts about historical facts. And of course, you know, CRT is connected with the 1619 Project, which is not historical factually correct. So, you know, that confuses people in that whole thing. But going back to what you were talking about not being able to teach understanding and so forth by the students, or the teachers not understanding the bill, the idea is that you teach both sides of a subject. You don't teach one heavy-weighted position and don't teach the other side. And that's what we were having happen, because they were taking the ideas of the critical race theory and looking upon the stuff like that capitalism is bad, not talking about the positives of capitalism, for example. And all that stuff came out of the historical basis of critical race theory. And so you can separate what you're talking about as critical race theory is one thing, but all these things that you talked about that are the outcome have become critical race theory in our schools. The idea that students feel insecure or that they are the oppressor. Why should any child be made to feel like they're an oppressor? And I contend that most students don't even notice race until we're talking about little kids in second, third, fourth grade. They don't think from the lens of racism whenever they're relating in their classroom. And it brings that up and it forces that issue. And this really started coming about when teachers became when parents became aware of what was being taught in the classrooms. Instead of emphasizing your basic skills of learning to read, they were putting the kids through different kind of little simulations and games and so forth.
So Rashawn, what are you seeing with the studies at the Brookings Institution in terms of that? You noted that early on in the program. What are you seeing in terms of those studies that are happening in these schools?
Yeah, so one of the things that Alexandra Gibbons and I did was, as researchers, we aim to take a very objective approach to this and say, okay, what do the bills consist of across the country? We did an extensive analysis. We continue to update that analysis as more bills come forth. And the big thing we found is that very few of these bills actually explicitly include the terms critical race theory. It's become very clear that these bills are about other things. Again, diversity, equity, and inclusion as a catch-all. And accordingly, I think it's a few things to note that when we hear people make statements like teach both sides of the issue, if people are trying to teach something that is anti-racist, what is the opposite of that? We have to be very clear about what we're saying. If people are saying that slavery was something that was bad, what is teaching the opposite of that? I'll also say when it comes to the 1619 Project, these are some of the foremost scholars we have in the United States, around the world, who are at the top institutions in the country. But the third thing that I'll say is that children, studies document, this is some of the other things that our research and other scholars have found, is that as early as 4 years of age, students start to recognize difference, and race is one of those differences that they recognize. So part of this is these are just empirical facts that are completely true. And until we get on the same page about those, we cannot get on the same page about what is happening in the classroom.
Pat, I want to hear from you, and then I'd like Eesha to give us a sense of some of her research. But Pat, go ahead.
Okay, one of the things is, like you're talking about, they notice race. Yes, they'll notice that someone is different from them, but that doesn't mean they have a different feeling about them. So making it more personal, you try and build up this like, well, an antithesis, you're not what I want to be or anything like that. That's not the case. They just accept that someone is black, someone's white, someone's brown, And the fact is, you were talking about, I disagree totally with you about the historical source of 1619 Project. For everybody you say if it supports that, I can find many, many more that would say no, that is not historically correct at all. But back on your idea of what some of the different things like historically, it's not ever going to say that you have to give the other side of slavery or the other side of the Holocaust. That is not the way it's written. It says when current topic issues come up, then you give both sides of those issues.
I wish we had more time, but I really want to hear from you, Eesha, because you're covering this. Golly, it must be hard on teachers. How are they, how do they handle in the classroom talking about these issues when they may be really fearful about losing their jobs?
I think that is the primary challenge that teachers across the country are facing. There are studies coming out that are saying that teachers in almost 900 districts, there's a study from UCLA that said teachers in almost 900 districts are feeling that chilling effect that Rashawn was describing.
Rashawn, this is what I don't understand. You put critical race theory in this silo, and all these other things that have come out of critical race theory, the extensions of it that you were talking about, those are still considered critical race theory by the general public because they have been an outgrowth of critical race theory, right?
No, I'm an academic. I hear what the public thinks all the time. It doesn't mean that they're right. And in this case, this is one of those examples. Critical race theory is very, very streamlined about what it is and supposedly what it's supposed to do. These extensions, honestly, and this is where I say it's been politicized and weaponized. These are extensions to try to be a catch-all about these conversations that are happening. And I'll tell you, I think what's really happening is that this is about votes. This is about people thinking that you're going to have a generation that's going to probably be the largest voting bloc since baby boomers come to think differently about our society. And that's going to impact who they vote for and how they vote. I think that's what it's fundamentally about.
Well, whether it is your definition of critical race theory or whether it is the extension of this critical race theory, when I have parents call me and they tell me what their child has dealt with in the classroom by the criticism of the teacher, by the making the child feel like they're an oppressor, or these different games they play and so forth, it all becomes an umbrella for problems of people not concentrating on what is a positive education experience into a social contrive of whatever they've been up to in the classroom. In other words, even though you say critical race theory is over here, critical race theory has become all this other stuff, and it is disruptive to the actual learning process.
Rashawn, what do you think the solution is on the way this should be taught in schools?
Yeah, so I think it's a couple of things. I think the first big thing is, and this is a question I always start with people when talking about critical race theories, I ask them, have they read the actual documents? Oftentimes people have not. I encourage people to actually go do that. Look, I'm an academic. I'm a scholar. I don't expect for people to read things extensively as I do, but this is one of those topics where people should. I think the second biggest thing is that, look, it's very clear that having discussions about equality are important. I hope at least we can agree on that. But what that does mean is that there are differences in the way these sort of exercises are approached. I think we need some universal templates that are used because, of course, there are some teachers that go way too far that would have a lot of parents, regardless of their political attitudes and their attitudes more broadly, would have them concerned. There are some really good exercises that are quite impactful. And again, look, this is coming from a person. I work with police departments. I work with the military. I have a bias training program that's approved by the Maryland State Police Training Commission. I go into spaces regularly, and it's effective. And the problem is that people are trying to catch on to something because they don't exactly know what to do. And they're looking for guidance from policymakers and as well as from education institutions, and they're not leading the way. I think critical race theory is definitely going to have an effect, and particularly in states like Texas and other battleground states, whether it be Georgia or Florida, it's a very, very big deal. I think it's going to impact voter turnout, and I think particularly it's going to impact what is happening locally. And look, the whole point is we want our kids to be educated in a way that's important, in a way that's going to help them grow up to be functional adults. And we can at least say, let's get on the same page about that.
So, Pat, with 30 years of teaching high school students, what do you think the solution is here for teachers and parents to feel better about this, and even voters?
I think that teachers who know their subjects well, know their information well, are able to be conversant on different subjects. And one of the things that we put in the bill is to teach media literacy. The idea of hearing one side or the other and assuming that that is absolutely the correct thing is teachers need to stop doing that. Which side it is, it doesn't matter. You've got to hear both sides of these different topics and different subjects. So I think that the teachers are the teachers that are products of the university have heard this stuff in the university level, and they're coming into bringing some of these things and ideas into the classroom, when I personally think that they should spend more time not working about all the different inclusion and inequities and so forth, and start teaching their subject areas.
What about parents? Pat, what about parents? How can we have parents feel better about what's going on in the schools? Because that seems to be something they're saying, hey, I don't know what these teachers are teaching.
Well, I think Governor Abbott just yesterday said that they were going to push for more people being able to see the lesson plans that the various teachers have. But I say they need to concentrate more on what the standards are that we've given the school districts to write their curriculum from, and going off and spending more time on. There's nothing in the state standards that talks about, for example, the sexual parts of this critical race theory, where they're talking about transgender in the elementary and so forth. That's not a part of the state standards. And teachers need to stay clear of that because it is not a part of the state standards. If they concentrate on what they're supposed to be teaching, then there would not be time for these different controversial things to keep coming up and people putting their own particular bias in there.
Rashawn, is this a red-blue state issue to a degree?
To a degree, it is. I mean, what we found in our research is it might be primarily a purple state issue. So in other words, in blue states, it's not an issue, and primarily red states, it's not an issue, but a state like Texas, where people are fighting for votes, because I do think that critical race theory has been weaponized politically. So in purple states, Texas, Georgia, Florida, this is where we're seeing a lot of this rhetoric, very similarly to how we saw anti-lockdown protest as part of the same continuum. And I think the biggest thing is critical race theory, when I say it's being weaponized and we say it's a catch-all, some of the things that we just heard are not within the theoretical framework at all. I encourage people to really go read the actual documents. They'll see what it's actually about, and then they can make that decision. But don't simply just hear what people are saying when it's not being properly discussed.
We're running out of time, and I want to thank all of you. And, truly, I think this program has shown that our purpose, our commitment at the McQuiston program is to bring you different perspectives on issues that impact all of our daily lives so that we may be even more involved and informed citizens. We appreciate your watching, and we urge that you get involved and ask more about these issues. As always, we continue talking about things that matter with people who care. And we really want to hear from you. We want your comments. We want your opinions about our programs. And to do this, you can go to mcquistontv.com and share your perspectives with other people who care. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you again very soon.